Welcome everyone to the IEL Collective Conversation number 9. This conversation is going to be about race, international economic law, and the current pandemic. My name is Eslava. I work at Kent Law School. I'm a reader in international law there, and I also co-direct the Center for Critical International Law. My work is at the intersection between international law and development, and I use social legal approaches to study the history and effects of the global political economic order. Today we have a special guest for this conversation, or in this conversation. But before we let a special guest to introduce himself and my colleague Tara to introduce herself, I want to say a couple of things about why we're doing this. As our viewers know, we have been witnessing over the recent years across the history of the present global order, a very unsavory intersection between racism and the expansion of economic interests and the global market. We want to respond to that by kind of exploring some of the rationales and some of those unsavory relationships. But secondly, we are not only witnessing that prevalence of racism in very violent events in the US in recent weeks, but also in Brazil, India, and many other countries. So this is our kind of a small gesture towards recognizing the importance of exploring critically the role of racism in international economic law and how the international economic legal order continues to support the discrimination and many forms of racism. So before we start the conversation, and I'm gonna pass the word to Tara, my colleague at the International Economic Law Collective.
Thanks, Luis. Hi, my name is Tara Van Ho. I specialize in business and human rights at the University of Essex, and I particularly look at business and human rights in situations of armed conflict and also authoritarianism, as well as post-conflict and post-authoritarian reconstruction. I'm also the resident American, U.S. American on the IEL Collective Steering Group, and so I'm really grateful to Luis for putting this together and really excited that my old colleague, Kojo Koram, who has left us from Essex, not from, India, is here with us today. So Kojo.
Thank you for having me there, Tara. My name is Kojo Koram, and I'm a lecturer at the law school at Birkbeck College, University of London. As Tara mentioned, I used to be at the University of Essex, and before that, I actually used to be a student at the University of Kent. So this is very much a kind of, this is your life moment for me. And it's also a great opportunity to speak to the International Economic Law Collective. I have engaged and been in dialogue with many of the members of the collective and have a real investment in the work that the collective produces. And I think talking about these issues, about the relationship between international law, economics, and the ongoing problems of race, I think is a really urgent conversation at this particular time, not only intellectually, but also in terms of the political moment that we find ourselves in.
Kojo, thank you so much for being here with us. So I'm going to start the conversation by giving a quick account of one of the first moments in which we can see an intersection between race and international economic law. And for that, I want to use Francisco de Vitoria, a monk, a very important figure in the late 15th, early 16th century, who was the confessor of the main traders and political figures as Spain and the Spanish monarchy was expanding into the New World. In Francisco de Vitoria writings, and which were basically a summary of the advice that he gave to monarchs and traders, he sets up 3 rights that the Spanish conquerors and traders had in the New World. And these 3 rights are now, interestingly, the foundation of the current, still the current international economic order. So the 3 rights are the right to travel, the right to trade, and the right of equal treatment. So Francisco de Vitoria, basically, in giving his advice to traders and monarchs, he said that Spanish traders had the right to travel across the lands of the New World, and that they couldn't be prevented by indigenous people. And he understood that that was a natural right. He also understood that it was a natural right for Spanish conquerors to trade with indigenous people, in particular trade what indigenous people didn't have. And importantly, as a result of that, they also were entitled to take away with them what they abounded in indigenous lands. And he was very clear about that, in particular silver and gold. And in terms of the right of equal treatment, he said that Spanish conquerors and traders had the right to be treated equally as indigenous peoples were treating other communities around them or any other potential future conqueror. This right to equal treatment today is what we know as the principle of the most favored nation. Basically, a nation to be treated in the same way as any other nation when entering into economic relations. So behind Francisco de Vitoria's three rights, of course, many things: economic interest, there was his attempt to legitimize the Spanish colonial enterprise, but there is also race. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes is to explore race both as a color, as something, but as also as something else. Kojo, I'm wondering if you would like to take the opportunity to help us to start navigating this relationship between international economic law and race.
I mean, I think that the place that you started us from, Luis, is a fantastic starting point. The writings of Vittoria, even though they are from the 16th century, actually have a lot closer similarities to our conceptions of how international law navigates race today in the kind of liberal post 20th century international legal order than they do with the kind of high point of kind of 19th century positivist imperialism, tied as that was to a kind of strict racial hierarchy and an idea of kind of scientific racism as it started to condense itself within Europe. When we actually look at Vittoria, it's important to remember that whilst we might read the kind of qualifications of racism within Vittoria's work, at his particular historical moment, he was seen as a kind of defender of the indigenous people. He was seen in contrast with people like Sepulveda, who did see a kind of a strict difference, an untranslatable difference between the indigenous Americans that were being encountered in America and the Europeans that were making that transition over from Iberia. Vittoria really provides a kind of a tapestry for seeing how international law attempts to erase its understanding of racial difference. So Vittoria tries to create a kind of horizontal international law between the Amerindians and the Spanish, the idea that, there's an equality of treatment, there's an equality of trade, there's an egalitarianism between both of those sides. But he does that whilst determining what counts as that universal, egalitarianism, that universal equality, specifically in the terms of the Spanish and Iberian and Catholic understandings of what it is to be a human. And so, in kind of short terms, he says, like, we're all equal, but some are more equal than others. And the qualification for the Amerindians to prove their equality is to try and become as Spanish as possible, which of course they can never be. So that hierarchy remains. And I think that that is something that we're starting to have to contend with once again in international law here in the 20th and 21st century. Whilst in the 19th century, there was the idea of, only particular people have the power of sovereignty, only particular people have the power of actual civilization. Now, we are, the entirety of international legal discourse is enraptured with, the language of humanitarianism or development and other pathways for the former colonized to be able to enter into the realm of the universal, but one that seems to be indefinitely deferred.
Fantastic. So if I understand what your point that you're making is that what we have witnessed from the inception of the international legal economic order is a dual process of both sending to the background relationships, racial relationships by emphasizing formal equality. Is that what your point? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but then in that, if we are just witnessing that point, so why, what is the role of color in that configuration?
Well, I think the color, as it starts to concretize, really kind of following the transatlantic slave trade and its role in providing a material basis for our conceptions of race, and the idea that you know, particular people have to be of a yeah, of a lower classification of humanity in order to justify their trade as property in what was an incredibly profitable global commodities market. Thinking about it in international economic legal terms, that provides the ideology and theories of race a kind of material basis. And I think that, you know, what we're facing currently is international law adopting the language of colorblindness, adopting the language of post-colonialism, adopting the language of universalism, particularly following the kind of construction of the post-war international legal framework. But that legacy of that history of racism, that history of scientific racism, that history of, you know, transatlantic slavery continues to feed into the conceptions of what the universal is, conceptions of what the human is. You know, it's a kind of an indefinitely deferred invitation for the former colonized into the realms of the universal. And, you know, that's something that I think, you know, people look into the work of, you know, Sonia Pahuja or you know, the late great dearly departed Peter Fitzpatrick, would clearly see that really worked out fantastically.
Fantastic. And then, and Dennis, I'm wondering if you can help us to navigate another of those divisions that is here in this conversation, or that kind of underpins the conversation that we're having, which is between ethnicity and race, isn't it? So Dennis, that's the other kind of diad that accompanies these debates. So how, in your reading and in your work, do you understand that the dance between ethnicity and race?
Well, I think when we're talking about ethnicity, we're often talking about different categorizations of human collectives, which, you know, people who are anthropologists would have probably a better understanding than myself of how those are conceived of in a variety of different ways. But when we're thinking about race, and here I'd look at, you know, the kind of work of W.D. Du Bois, who, you know, the African American sociologist, but who also was a fantastic international relations scholar, and I think a really unused resource for international legal thinking. But his conception of what he talks about when he talks about the color line, when he talks about the way that race has been able to arrange human societies, is by the idea that by a primary physiological distinguishing feature, skin color, but also kind of secondary ones such as, you know, hair tightness and, you know, nose shape, that there is an entire set of actual kind of moral and mental capacity that is associated with that physiological stuff. That if you can identify the right physiological category, then you can understand what somebody's intelligence is, what somebody's athleticism is, what somebody's capacity for civilization is, and even what somebody's kind of moral anchoring is, and, you know, their capacity for empathy and capacity for generosity, or in a more negative terms, their capacity for vagrancy and lust and aggression. And so all of those stuffs gets associated with physiological characters. And I think that entire discursive product is the production of what we call race, tied to that material basis from transatlantic slavery and colonization.
Thank you, Tara. I'm wondering if you would like to intervene.
Sure. So that was a lot to think about, Kojo. Thank you. And there were a few things that struck me in terms of what you were talking about with how we've constructed who's good and who's bad, who's more prone to vagrancy and who's more prone to good governance, which is really, when we talk about international economic law, how it's often phrased. My work on investment law generally involves me screaming at the wind, but it also really involves a lot of long conversations with people who say that what I don't understand about investment law is that it's fundamentally about protecting people from bad governance. And what that often means in my experience is that they're trying to protect people from governance from non-Western states. Because when it comes to investment law, the US doesn't really lose cases, right? And there's specific language in one of the cases, I think it's Methanex, it is Methanex, where they talk about how anybody who enters the United States should assume that the legislative process is messy, and we should accept that that's going to be part of our reality as foreign investors. That same sort of protection of good governance, because that's what legislation that changes in light of scientific evidence and democratic input is, it's good governance. That's not afforded to Mexico when people are protesting against landfills. It's not afforded to Colombia when people want to preserve ecologically sensitive areas. It's not afforded to Argentina when they have to respond to water shortages and a financial crisis. And so we still have inherited those structures from history to tell us now as to who is good and who is bad, who is acceptable in terms of governance and who is not. And we can try to pretend that investment law or international economic law generally doesn't have that as its great foundation. And increasingly I'm hearing investment lawyers say, but that's the old investment law, like we have the new investment law. But it is like all other forms of racism, it has a foundation in our society. And unless you deconstruct that foundation intentionally, all you're doing is substituting one new racism for an old system of racism. And, you know, all of my conversations this week have either been about George Floyd and what's going on in the United States, or they've been about investment law. I have no life. But the reality is I see so many parallels there, because the structural violence that we saw against George Floyd, you know, I hear a lot of Americans, white Americans who are upset about the protests talk about how two wrongs don't make a right. And I keep coming back to the fact that it's not two wrongs, right? It's not the murder of George Floyd and the people who are rioting. It is the murder of George Floyd, which is connected to the murder of Breonna Taylor, which is connected to the murder of Tamir Rice, which is connected to the murder of Trayvon Martin, which is connected to the murder of Eric Garner, which is connected to the murder of Emmett Till, right? So there is a string of people who have been killed through racial violence in the United States, and the foundation is one that means that you can't just say, okay, now we're drawing a line in the sand and let's move forward and we're all one people and we all love each other, right? The foundation has created those realities. And unless we intentionally deconstruct that foundation, we're never going to move forward. And the same is true with investment law. Unless we intentionally deconstruct a foundation that has its origins, as you said, in Vittoria's writings about, in which he gets to decide as a Spaniard what the rights are of Amerindigenous peoples. Unless we sort of are honest with that reality and deconstruct those fears, then we don't have a chance to reconstruct anything new.
It's really interesting what you say, Tara. When I was preparing for the conversation today, I tried to kind of list what a particular colors stand for in international law and the international economic order. So what color? What is the job of color? And of course, is a coded. It's an image that that is underpinned by an entire kind of set of assumptions, or it is a code for something. And then I was trying to list them, and then I came out with a few things. So it is a code of less kind of civility, rationality, worth, and rule of law. And this is what we are dealing here with. Okay, so in individual and collective relations, as well as legal relations, particular kind of colors have come to stand as having less civility, less rationality, less worth, and less rule of law. And that legitimizes an entire apparatus that, of course, needs to train those peoples to become more civil, more rational, have a better appreciation of themselves and their surroundings, and better law. Yesterday, I had I just came across a fantastic new little documentary in which the fantastic Ruth Wilson Gilmore um, um, kind of explores the idea of racial capitalism and the geographies of racial capitalism. I recommend everyone to have a look at it. And then she said something really powerful about what is behind these kind of sets of assumptions that underpin racial differentiation. And then she said, you know, the departing point of the conversation always should be, and even for this conversation that we're having here, then capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. Okay, so so here we're not just simply dealing with colors and what they stand for. We're dealing here with a particular economic system that requires racial differentiation in order to legitimize processes of expansion and accumulation.
Absolutely, and I would say that that's something that we see from the start when we think about the role of primitive accumulation and actual the construction of the architecture of what becomes modern capitalism. When we think about we mentioned the transition from that period of kind of formal colonialism, formal racial segregation, in terms of law, these differences between human beings enshrined in law in South Africa, the United States of America, Brazil, a lot of other different jurisdictions. We talk about the transition through that into the kind of moment of universal humanity that international law likes to tell us that we find ourselves in. But there isn't a disavowal of that history, and there isn't an attempt to unpack the actual material foundations of that history as we go through that kind of juridical moment of transition. In fact, what we get when we think about, what Tara was saying a little bit further about the role of international investment law today is, and for any listeners, I'd really recommend looking at Quinn Slobodian's globalists for really unpacking this. We kind of have a moment of law encasing that particular modus apparatus of distributing resources outside of the humanity that is now being awarded and now being shared to individuals around the world. So in Quinn's book, he really details how much the current architecture of international economic law, international investment law, ideas around what I guess what we commonly describe as neoliberalism have at their root the desire to produce a kind of protective umbrella for transnational economic trade outside of the sovereignty that was now being won by all of these former colonies around the world. As Tara and Louise was mentioning earlier, when we think about what states are seen as unreliable in terms of foreign investment, what states are seen as unreliable in terms of ideas around global trade. That unreliability is something that has really fueled the strength of international investment and economic law in order to protect what is essentially multinational and always will be multinational capital from the unpredictability of the people we consider now have become human, but not human enough that we can rely upon them to have the reciprocity that's necessary for both law and capitalist trade. So I wonder what, I'd be interested in both of your opinions on what might actually be the consequences of that for what we would consider the global north, the kind of former imperial powers. I was really interested in what you were saying, Tara, about the role of international investment law in terms of the United States, and there's been this architecture that's been created to protect global trade and protect foreign investment from unpredictable, governments in the global south. But now I think that we are also finding the kind of entrenched power that has facilitated for multinational capital having detrimental effects here in definitely the United Kingdom. If you think about, some of the interests around Brexit and also in the United States as well. And I think that that ties into the kind of economic deprivation that also fueled the uprisings. So the George Floyd incident over the past week. It's not only the people are tired of seeing George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and endless images of essentially black execution in America, but it's also the economic deprivation that both black and increasingly white Americans are also facing as a result of the entrenched power of multinational capital within that. Is there a kind of a blowback? I'd be interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think the economic deprivation is, it is weaponized to institutionalize racism in the United States. When we talk about sort of school funding is one of my go-to examples of how economic deprivation and the interests of capital are used to create racial divisions that can then be used to control narratives within the United States and ultimately control people. Until fairly recently, I'm talking about 20 years ago, most states in the United States funded school systems via local property taxes. Ohio still primarily does this, so that's where I'm from. And when you do that, if what you have is areas that are redlined, which the United States did until, again, fairly recently, I think it was late 1970s, well into the 1980s, sorry, where they would say that you could get government loans for if you wanted to buy a house in certain areas, but not others. Well, where were those certain areas? Those certain areas where if you wanted to buy houses in primarily white areas, you could get loans. If you wanted to buy houses in primarily black areas, you couldn't. What that does is ultimately create economic incentives for the property within white areas and economic disincentives for property within black areas. Property values in white areas go up. School systems in white areas get more money. The schools become better, they attract more investment, and it becomes quite circular. And in black areas, you have the exact opposite. Well, it's also true of rural areas, right? So if you're in Ohio, we have essentially cities, suburbs, and very rural areas. Rural areas also don't have the property values to sustain, to really sustain strong school systems. When you divide it then into these three parts, what you have is primarily urban black areas, primarily rural white areas, and then suburbs, which are mixed but tend to veer white. That creates tension between the two outlying groups, right? You can start to control and manipulate information to both of those groups that allow them to see the other as the enemy. And in the United States, that really takes place in the educational system, where how we discuss slavery, how we discuss issues of reparations, the fact that we haven't had a reparations program for slavery, that's often skimmed over. So you'll hear about the promise of 40 acres and a mule for every freed black man following the Civil War. You don't hear about the fact that that never came to fruition. You don't hear about how fragile that relationship was in the first post-Civil War Reconstruction era, and then how it was eviscerated in the 1910s and into the 1920s and into the 1930s. And when I say eviscerated, I mean like structurally, intentionally broken down, and the KKK rising up, the Daughters of the Confederacy rising up to institutionalize, again, the narrative of Black people being lesser than. And we don't talk about how the government has continued to come in, that white capitalism has continued to come in and intervene and reestablish those structures that were once broken down. And that's because we don't actually intentionally break them down, right? We sort of acknowledge that they exist, and then we do nothing to sort of combat them. Or we combat them in one particular way and then ignore all the other sort of ways that it moves around. In terms of what are the consequences for the global north in this current, sorry, I realized that I wasn't actually answering Kojo's question. In terms of the consequences, we are at a place right now where if I'm being honest, it's hard for me sometimes to conceptualize where we go from here. And part of that comes down to issues of habits. So I've been doing a lot of reading about the psychology of habits and how do we establish them. And the reality is that it's really difficult to unlearn a habit once you've established it. It's easier to sort of start a new habit. So if you have, if every day you have coffee at 3 o'clock and you want to cut down on your coffee, it's easier for you to, rather than say, I don't want a coffee at 3 o'clock, it's easier for you to start something else. Like I'm going to have water at 3 o'clock instead. We need to sort of think of what we want the new habit of international economic law to be, so we can start to build a structure for doing that. And the reality is when I try to imagine what that looks like, I'm so influenced by the structures that we have that reconceptualizing it is really quite difficult for me. So I'm hoping somebody else has better answers to that.
That's extremely powerful, Tara. So, and I think if you want to kind of put it in legal terms, what the habit and the habit that we're discussing here is the habit of formal equality, and letting formal equality rule over kind of very evident and clear structural inequalities. So and how this habit of formal equality plays out. So international economic law presents itself as an instrument to solve global lacks, okay? Global lacks that have a domestic local phase. So there is a country that requires fertilizers, other countries requires white goods. So the producing countries of those two, fertilizers and white goods, send them over and then receives something that they need. Problem solved. Formal equality does that job in a clear way, in a clean, clear way, and it does so by using these three rights that Francisco de Vitoria taught us a long time ago: the right to travel, the right to trade, and the right to be treated equally. Now, when you go and look at what actually international economic law does, is not necessarily by solving lacks, but by sponsoring and helping the accumulation of capital. And it is just not a big surprise. And it does so by, kind of expanding the realm of desires of people that can purchase your products. And that exercise is legitimized because of course, we still have lacks, very clear lacks in the global order, by saying, let me continue this expansion, and at some point there's going to be some trickle down, okay? Either trickle down in terms of kind of monetary trickle down, or some of those white goods also going to get there to people and going to solve some need that maybe don't, they are not clear, it's not very clear that they have. The challenge is enormous then. I mean, if you think in those terms, and it is enormous because in that way of understanding how we resolve needs through international economic law has been kind of around for a long time, again, back all the way to Francisco de Vitoria, but also because the expansion of the global trade has got to a point that has ended up dominating every single sphere of our lives and every single aspect of our lives. I just want to say something that is really kind of hard to grapple with in this kind of broad scenario that I just sketched, is that we are all participants in it, okay? So we are all keen consumers of things that we don't want. And we are all consumers of it, being white, being black, being Latino, or being something else. So that's a tough part of the story, isn't it?
I mean, I really think so. And to go back on some of the topics that are raised last time, I was discussing, the role of kind of discourses around humanitarianism, discourses around development, in entrenching those old dynamics of kind of racialization and segregation between peoples around the world. But also, being a person who's grown up kind of half within the global north in Britain and half in the global south in Ghana, where I was born and my extended family are, I also see the way that the way that the desire from people within the global south for those discourses around development, for those discourses around engagement, even at a very kind of crude level, engagement with kind of multinational corporately produced commodity goods within the global south has even more law, even a law power than it does, in the global north. I think about the relationship and the role and the kind of ubiquity of things like Coca-Cola within Ghana and within West Africa, or within, with Pepsi and stuff. Like, you can see whole houses, so they don't just advertise on billboards when I go to Ghana. They advertise on whole houses, on human beings. You'll see people walking in the street wearing just their underpants painted head to toe in Coca-Cola and carrying Coca-Cola cans on their head. So the kind of libidinal allure of global capitalism and our investment in it as a pathway towards reaching that universal humanity that Victoria promised us, 400 years ago, is something that I think stays with us today. I don't know what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I always try to think about the participate, what underpins that participations in the global market. Okay, so because I hesitant to condemn those desires for consumption and those desires to have a functional computer in the 21st century, even though you stay or you don't have the capacity to buy it or to produce it. So I think the challenge then, so one can just not go down the road of condemning those desires and condemning perhaps even the need of having a suffering, whatever, it is to try to think about how to reconstruct international economic law and the international economic legal order in a way that is it is respectful of those desires, but don't profit illegitimately from those desires, and doesn't rule by exploitation at its modality of operation, I suppose. Now, this, of course, that's an optimistic view of how it works, because the system is not going to stop and then say, okay, now we're going to put aside exploitation and this we're just going to satisfy desires. But there's still there's still a point to that, and the point to that is that we have had examples, historical examples, in which we have engaged in systems of production where local needs are satisfied, maybe they are expanded, but then autonomy is ensured as a result of that. And here what I have in mind is what the new international economic order tried to do, and those kind of national development projects that somehow came to dominate the second half of the 20th century in many countries in the global south. There are a whole panoply of problems with those projects, but at that point, at least international economic law order enable international economic legal order, enable countries to build economic systems that in its functioning help to ensure the right to self-determination. That's long gone in many respects.
Sorry, I'm still processing what you just said.
It's really tough, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, what we're essentially tasking ourselves with is figuring out how do you take what works within the current economic system and build on that to do something that the economic system isn't designed to do. And I don't know how you reconcile those two things, because the reality is you're right. The system's not going to stop. It's not going to say, we missed the year 2000. So there's no natural stopping point in which we say, okay, December 31st, 2020, that's it. And now we're going to reconstruct ourselves and start again. And if we tried to do that, capitalism protects itself, right? So we would come up against the claims, some legitimate claims and some very illegitimate claims about the rights of due process and other interests for those who have the capital now. And so we've tasked ourselves with this idea of constructing something that that better resembles our greater desires on the back of something that encapsulates all of the worst of our human instincts. So it's about how do we tie greed with respect for other people. Now there are ways to do that, but the ways that we've done it in the past often are tied to either religious or cultural beliefs, right? So if you look at sort of why John Locke took the position that he did about greed and the limits of consumption, it was on the foundation of religious belief. If you look at why Indigenous communities respect the earth the way that they do and take care of it the way that they do and take care of each other the way that they do, there's often a religious element to that. We don't have a common religion, and I think that's a positive thing. And I would be opposed to sort of the construction of a form of common morality or religious, I shouldn't say morality, but religious belief system that propels us towards that. And so we need to figure out what the foundation is for the new international economic order that's beyond something like human rights, because while obviously, you know, I primarily identify as a human rights lawyer, and my life's work is wrapped up in the notion of human rights. It's become such a loaded term that the idea that you would deconstruct capitalism for the purpose of human rights I just feel like it's a losing argument from the beginning. So we need a different nomenclature for the foundation. And I just, thinking through that is actually a little bit overwhelming. Kojo, save me.
I mean, I definitely have nothing that's able to I think save our struggles to try and think through these problems. But I do have a suggestion that maybe it is not in the thinking through that some of these solutions might be produced, but it's in the, you know, in the organizing, in the construction of attempts at resistance towards the current towards the current overarching dynamic. The new dynamics might be found. You know, I think that one thing that often kind of stays with me is the American philosopher Cornel West, who kind of describes the quest of Black America to engage in freedom and to find and discover its own avenues for freedom as the blues music of the American political project, the American political experiment in democracy, as in it's kind of like the source that actually feeds into all these other avenues. And, you know, thinking about the way that the civil rights movement in the 1960s has bled into LGBT rights and all, you know, the other ways that people have been able to kind of, access and establish their own humanity within the American political project. You know, I think that when I see a lot of the news reports about, you know, like Tara mentioned, that kind of one wrong doesn't create another wrong, and there's that kind of there's an equivalence made between the loss of human life and the loss of property that's being felt by a lot of you know, business owners during this moment of kind of American racial uprising. I do feel that there's also a missing of the opportunity for these communities to try and imagine and think through within them, you know, what are the different ways of us being able to organize our lives and organize the meeting of our needs and the production of resources that doesn't lead to the same kind of moments of Benjaminian rupture and moments of confrontation that the capitalism seems to produce. You know, it's maybe shifting a little bit away from the kind of overly rationalized language of the law and a little bit more into the more kind of philosophical language of kind of you know, lived experience. And maybe that is something that was also bleeding into that kind of new economic international order moment, that a lot of the you know, when you think about not so much Michael Manley, but his father Norman, and a lot of that, those kind of leaders had experience, or at least a recent experience of actual political struggle. And I think that bleeds into the ways that you can try and reimagine the world. And so it's maybe in the doing that those new models might start to emerge.
That's a very valuable what you what you're bringing here into the conversation, the idea of the doing rather than the thinking as a way forward. And you remind me of what, of course, our own students have been able to achieve over recent years through the decolonizing, the decolonizing movement, and how they, through their own actions and concerns and their own activism, have forced us in a very valuable way to reorganize our own thinking and our own teaching practices. So that's I see that as part of the same agenda, and what Tara was kind of inviting us to start embracing different sorts of habits. So the habit has been for a long time to set up canonical text that are from Europe, then use as the standard for the globe, European realities. That has been our habit. Now that habit is not any longer kind of well seen. We have to embrace another habit. And so it's slowly becoming part of our practice to look outside the canon, not just because we want to be quirky and interesting, but because it's part of how things should be done. And I think that's extremely valuable. And again, it speaks to what just Kojo mentioned.
Yeah, you guys are actually giving me a lot of hope. Sorry, I realized that I went like down a deep, dark tunnel with my last intervention. And you guys have actually, I think, laid out a really good path that I think we can build upon, because it is about what are the steps that we take when we make the decisions that we make, right? So when you're thinking about whether it's organizing or whether it's how you construct your lives, we take paths and we go through specific steps every single day. And if we can sort of become cognizant of the steps that we do take, then we are able to sort of intervene and replace those old habits with new habits. So what do new habits look like if you're talking about a situation like George Floyd? It means, setting up an independent prosecutor and an independent police group to look at it, police force to look at it. And then that becomes the default, right? And the same thing can be true of international economic law, rather than, wildly defaulting to these existing bits and these existing free trade agreements that we have. There are ways in which we can think through the construction of those processes, right? Right now, they're negotiated by the elites. And if we get a draft of the copy of a treaty during the negotiation process, it's usually under wraps and it's super secret, and it's for the purpose of analyzing it to feed back to the political parties who are doing the negotiation. If we can start to establish new habits and say, China and the EU are negotiating a treaty, and so the first starting point is to have serious conversations with what we want, with the society as a whole, as to what we want this treaty to facilitate, rather than allowing just the elites to do it. Then we can start to bring in some of these organized groups, these organized civil societies into the process of establishing what our economic pathway is and what values should be underpinning these economic relationships. Because right now those values are established and decided for us by capital and by the elites. And if we can start to establish a more communal response, I think we have a pathway forward. There are ways in which we can sort of establish these new patterns of negotiation, of really thinking through what our fundamental values are as a global community. And we haven't really done that since 1948. And even then, that was done, again, by a subset of the society, and by a subset of that subset of the society.
We need to start wrapping up, and I was wondering if you let me to bring COVID-19 into the conversation. So as we all know, we are going through a very difficult moment globally. And then one thing that this virus has taught us is that the precarities that have underpinned the global legal, economic, social, cultural, and political order becoming even more prescient, and there's no refuge, there's no way to escape them, and those precarities are now bubbling up and then really killing large sections of the global population, in particular what in the UK we call Black and ethnic minorities. So I just wondering, Kojo, if you would like to reflect for a few minutes on COVID-19 and how we can respond to it and move beyond what it has revealed.
I mean, I think to start by just really sitting with the kind of tragedy of both this kind of visceral, kind of horrific example of kind of loss of Black life with the George Floyd murder coming immediately alongside a pandemic that, in terms of the global north, in terms of the United Kingdom, the United States, is disproportionately impacting upon Black and ethnic minority people. You know, that is a really heavy situation when we're trying to think about movements towards a society where race is not a determinant of your quality of life or your ability to have a life. In fact, you know, the UK government delayed the release of the report on the investigation into Black and ethnic minority deaths by COVID-19 because they didn't want to add to the already bubbling anger following the George Floyd murder. And so that, you know, that's quite a condemnation for those who would try to insist that we currently live in a kind of post-racial society. And I think that, you know, this isn't, you will see not only in like kind of dark Reddit forums, but in mainstream presses, the a quite dark kind of eugenicist understanding of why there is this disproportionate impact of COVID-19 upon Black and minority ethnic people, you know, in the United Kingdom, you know, discussions around, you know, the relationship to vitamin D implementation or the relationship. And I'm not saying that all of those, you know, I don't have the scientific background to say there might not be some value within some of those assumptions, but I think that those aren't going to be the entirety of the definition as to why that's happening. You know, just take the United Kingdom as a classic example. The two minority ethnic groups that have far disproportionate responses in terms of harm and death to COVID-19 are people from the Afro-Caribbean community and people from the Pakistani community. And, you know, those are not those are not from a shared genetic pool in terms of anyone's kind of definition, whatever that might mean. And so we have to take seriously the kind of sociological and economic factors that are producing this level of vulnerability. And we need to try and think through how we can create a society that doesn't allow for that social and economic deprivation, so that when, you know, the next pandemic arrives, or when the next global climate change crisis arrives, or whatever is coming down the post, that it doesn't have this disproportionate impact, and people's ability to survive that coming crisis isn't determinant upon kind of racial and ethnic groups.
So there's this interesting thing, because you've hit a lot of the points that I think really need to be discussed a lot more in terms of how we respond to COVID and the relationship between precarity. But there's this other interesting facet of how racism has influenced our responses to COVID, and it's that we haven't actually learned lessons from places that have really valid lessons to learn, right? So the West has largely ignored what Hong Kong and Malaysia and Singapore were doing to stop the spread. Africa as a continent, and I don't usually lump Africa as a continent into one little box, but Africa as a continent has responded in a much stronger way to the threat of COVID than Europe ever has. And then Europe continues to. And that's why you see, you know, this notion, this eugenic notion that something's amiss within the Black community within the UK. Well, only if there's something special about the Black community in the UK that isn't shared with Black communities elsewhere in the world, because we're not seeing this kind of rate of infection and death elsewhere. But we didn't learn lessons from the states that have struggled with issues like Ebola. And how do you respond to that? And how do you respond to these really deadly infectious diseases? And that's really wrapped up in this Western and white supremacist notion that somehow we have figured these things out. And it is our job as the West to go in and save you, everyone else who is not Western, when you have health-related issues, but the reciprocity isn't there. And that ended up being, I mean, that's really come to be quite devastating for the West, because our own supremacist understanding of where we sit in the world and where we can learn from, who we can learn from, means that our science was off, our scientific response was really quite limited. And that's, that I think is something that I hope also gets reflected on. There's all this expectation that Africa as a continent would sort of be devastated by COVID-19 and they'd never be able to recover, and it was going to be millions of people dying. If Africa had followed how Europe did it, yeah, that's absolutely how it would have been. But if Europe had followed how Africa did it, we'd be in a much stronger place right now. And so we really need to think through moving forward.
Can I just add to that? Just a couple of examples to really speak to what Tara's wonderfully articulated. When the first WHO guidance came, there's the UK's health officer goes actually up on that 5 p.m. press briefing and says how, well, we don't have to follow this because the WHO is really constructing its health advice for developing countries and not for an advanced country like the United Kingdom. So this is why we're going to follow our own herd immunity kind of line, and we've seen the impact of that. But unfortunately, I don't think that it seems that those lessons are going to be learned. I mean, we've just seen, we'll see in the future, but we've just seen the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, talking about, the restrictions in terms of travel coming in from places overseas and talking about his concern that a second spike might be provoked by people coming in from all of these countries. Some of the countries listed in there have no deaths of COVID-19, and the UK has the largest excessive deaths from COVID-19, at least in Europe. Some people are estimated potentially in the world, but also we're assuming that the infection is going to come from outside. I mean, this is where I think we've talked a lot about the kind of material and kind of rational basis for race and racism, and this has emerged over the period of European modernity. But I think Frans Fanon and a lot of other scholars also are really useful for thinking about the kind of psychic irrationality that then kind of mutates out of that. And I think that is a perfect example of that. That even when the United Kingdom has a much worse death rate from COVID-19 than other countries, places like Sub-Saharan Africa, places like Vietnam, that in our mind, we still see them as the kind of infectious outsider who are going to come in and contaminate our body politic because of that legacy of racialized thinking.
There's also, of course, the how easy it is to forget the people that work in the system. Okay, so, and then, we call them workers, but those workers are have a particular background, and in particular, the ones in the lower pay scale, normally minority ethnic individuals. And these are the people that are passing away really fast. And one thing that is very sad about this story is that they are dying within a system that was the outcome of the most progressive phase of late modernity, the NHS. Okay, so a system that was set up in order to provide health to everyone equally as a result of economic transformation that have taken place over the course of the last 30 years. Now it is populated and it is organized around logics that in a pandemic kill people, particular individuals. And that's really extremely sad. So I again, in terms of the challenge ahead, is how we can re-inhabit these progressive modern structures in a way that they do not perpetuate, just to put it plainly, racism.
So there was something really interesting what you said about who's suffering here, who's suffering the result of the policy. And then when you think about the lived experience of the people who are making the policy, and they are not from Black and ethnic minority communities, right? So yes, you have your Priti Patels, but that's not the norm within the body politic that's making decisions as to how we respond to COVID. And so those lived experiences, there's a real fissure there, whereby the people who are living the experience of the impact of the policy and the people who are living the experience of developing the policy really aren't the same people. And that's having a really detrimental impact as to how we proceed. There isn't the conversation between those two groups. And let's be clear, it's on this side, it's on the people who are making the policy. It's their responsibility to reach out and talk to people who are living the experience, and they're not doing it. And that's why you end up in these situations where you're having communities who are really devastated because no one is actually listening to them and asking them what they need. And the reality is what they need is not to go, I mean, in my experience and in what I know of growing up in the lower economic rungs of society, it's not to go back and rush back to work immediately. It's to actually have a universal basic income. It's to have a bailout that features and focuses on people who are in lower socioeconomic classes, so they're not forced to go back and work in jobs that expose them to high rates of people, whether that's retail or at the NHS, where they're interacting with hundreds of people a day and are therefore more likely to be exposed and are more likely to then spread it onto other people. So if you want to respond, actually listen to the people who are affected. And our elites don't do that right now.
Kojo, I want to invite you to close this conversation.
Close it. I mean, it's been such a rich and wide-ranging conversation. I don't know how to wrap it all up. I mean, I guess I might start by. I guess I was very upset by being accused of being an optimist a little bit earlier. As you know, this is something that, as any self-respecting critical lawyer would take as a deep offense. But I think that the reason why I do have some options or some optimism or some attempts to try and see different pathways for international economic legal arrangements is, I guess, my kind of immediate research focus had been on kind of international laws on drugs and the transition from what was in the 19th century, at the height of European imperialism, an incredibly profitable commodities market for corporations like the East India Company, with the opium wars and distribution of a lot of prohibited substances all around the world, that transitions into being an incredibly repressive mechanism for militarized policing over the 20th century with the international war on drugs. And, I don't think I'd have to explain to a lot of listeners the intimate relationships between the war on drugs and continuations of racial criminal justice systems, racial policing, racial violence, not just in the United States of America, but in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico. A lot of these other places have really felt the consequences of that. But now we're at a point where at least with cannabis, that there's a transition again, it seems, and we're actually having a moment of the attempt to create or recreate an international commodities market with the legalization of cannabis that's happening across many jurisdictions around the world. But at least within the kind of policy communities that I'm embedded in, there's a real conversation about how do we stop this just becoming another commodity that facilitates violence within the international legal realm, being another, gold or diamond or oil. And at the moment, it's really tense because the space of legal cannabis has really been taken by multinational corporate power. With the kind of difficult position of the law that they are the only ones who are often able to access the necessary capital to open up dispensaries and to have the kind of wraparound financial and legal services to do that. But we're also seeing, not just in the United States, but also in Spain and a lot of other places, attempts to construct kind of cooperative models of being able to open these dispensaries, of being able to produce these particular commodities, of being able to transport them. And, this is something that people are trying to map out and scale out for what's essentially a global commodity, if, or what most people think, when, that full transition into legalization happens. And so that's for me is like a kind of concrete specific space where we can think about how can we imagine international economic relationships in a different way that don't reinscribe violence in a new modality. And so I guess working in that makes me think that there are people trying to imagine that, trying to think about cooperative and communal models of production, distribution, consumption outside of what we've already known. And hopefully that might, if it's able to be successful, bleed into other areas of trade.
Kojo, on behalf of the International Economic Law Collective, thank you so much for being with us. Thanks, Tara. I think this conversation has been extremely useful for me. I'm sure it's going to be for our listeners. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.